This is a quick response to what customer wanted. You do, and the customers were happy with it. In fact, at one stage, as I said, Kumasi people were calling us a foreign exchange bank, but which so. That's how the Kumasi people told us. You see, because these are things which attracted them. They think, oh, if you go to the bank, they will do everything. Even if you want a foreign exchange, you will get it. That's what they thought.
Hello.
I remember my first assignment, when it came, the first assignment was to.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to tonight's program. Shall we please stand as we welcome the speakers in the chair? And please, while they walk in, kindly put your phones on silent. Thank you.
President of the Academy, past presidents of the Academy, vice presidents of the Academy, fellows of the Academy, the Chief Executive Officer of UMB Bank, the Executive Director of Business UNB Bank, the Governor and executives of the UNB Bank, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Ghana's premier learned society, I warmly welcome you all to this year's 3-day public forum. This event is being streamed live on the Academy's Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook platforms. The Academy's public forum, which usually takes place in June every year, started as a collaboration with the Frederick Ebert Foundation in 1993. The maiden event was on the theme, Making Democracy Work in the Fourth Republic. Two decades thereafter, in 2013, the public forum became exclusively a Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences event. Over the years, the public forum has dealt with themes such as accountability in governance, genetically modified organisms, waste management, migration and development, and sustainable development goals and national development. This year's theme is the African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. That the topic is an important one goes without saying, in view of the economic circumstances in which Africa finds itself at the moment. And I have no doubt that the experts invited to speak on various sub-themes who will be introduced to you shortly will do justice to their topics and make your time here with us worthwhile. This year, we are delighted to announce that we have support from UNB Bank, which is celebrating its 50th year and is collaborating with us to organize this all-important event. We thank them for their support. Let me at this point invite the Executive Director of Business, UNB Bank, Mr. Ni Amonkra Tete, to say a few words. Mr. Tete.
The Learned Academy, esteemed presidents past and present, distinguished speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Your Investor Merchant Bank is proud to be a sponsor to the Academy's Public Forum in 2022 as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations. UNB was established as a policy bank in 1972 with the aim of providing the Ghanaian state with an indigenous capacity for merchant banking. 50 years on, our scope has expanded, but our focus remains the same, doing all we can to ensure the Ghanaian economy becomes one of the very best in Africa and beyond. Our sponsorship to the forum is a testament that we remember that the conceptualization and formation of our bank was probably arrived at in deliberations such as these. The substantive point here being that ideas and analysis and research of academia often drive and leads to very positive outcomes. This is why in our 50-year history, our bank has prioritized indigenous thought leadership as part of our CSR. Indeed, throughout the very first decade of this century, Merchant Bank, as we were then known, pioneered the ISA Merchant Bank annual economic lectures, as you can see from some of the pictures here, and they were very well patronized. So indeed, in this, our Jubilee year, we essentially are tracking back to our heritage, and we are proud to do this with the Academy. Finally, the topic this year for us was a remarkable stroke of serendipity. For a fully Ghanaian bank with aspirations for exponential growth, AFCA features significantly in our medium to long-term plans. So we are most eager to tap into the erudite deliberations to learn from them so that we are future fit to take advantage of this game changer. And for all our guests who are here, we urge you to take advantage of it. Students, actors in the economy, academia. How can we really bring this idea to Ghanaians? For whilst Africa is moving to Ghana to tap into it, it appears Ghanaians are so far removed. I must conclude by once more expressing how deeply honored we are to be part of this program and to say a big Oyiwala Don for coming tonight, and to urge you all to please come to UMB so we can serve you and make available to you the UMB advantage. That advantage that has and continues to provide a uniquely Ghanaian perspective to banking since 1972. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Director of Business, Mr. Ni Amonkra Tete. Now it is my singular honor to introduce to you the chairperson for this evening's event. She is Emerita Professor Isabella Kwachi, Vice President for the Sciences Section of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Kwachi is a professor of immunology and parasitology at the University of Ghana. The first emerita professor in the sciences at the University of Ghana, she established the immunology unit at the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research from 1980 to 1983. She was the first female director of the University of Ghana School of Public Health and the foundation dean of this school, also making her the first female dean in the College of Health Sciences at the University of Ghana, having served from 2002 to 2007. Emerita Professor Kwachi has served on numerous national and international committees and boards and received several awards. She is a former member of the Ghana Health Service Council and former UNESCO Chair for Women in Science and Technology in the West Africa region. She won the 2014 Laureate African Union Kwame Nkrumah Award for Women in Science. She is the 2019 laureate for the Clara Southmead Ludlow Award by the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Women's World Day 2021 recognized Emerita Professor Kwachi as one of 7 women in science who have changed our world for the better. In addition to being a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council of the Academy, she is a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our chairperson.
President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Vice Presidents of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Fellows of the Ghana Academy of Sciences, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and especially the Chief Executive, Mr. Ni Amonkra Tete of UMB, all protocols observed, good evening. I know you were expecting to see the President chairing our first session, but the President unfortunately had an emergency, so I'm standing in for him. So that's why you're not seeing the President of the Academy, but you're seeing the Vice President Sciences. So the emergency is covered. But he will be online listening to us. Thank you. We are very fortunate this year. This is a public forum, which is our very cherished flagship program. And this year we have the special opportunity and really privileged to share it in a collaboration with the Universal Merchant Bank. And it's on the theme, African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. And this is a 3-day affair. And for day 1, our theme is economic structure and intra-African trade. And we have 3 excellent speakers to talk to us. Our first speaker will give us an opening address, and then we have 2 excellent topics, and I will introduce each speaker when they're ready to talk. So to give us an opening address, we have Ms. Beatrice Chaito. Did I say that right? Head Trade in Service Division of AFCFTA. Now, Ms. Chaito is an international trade lawyer specializing in providing advice and support to African governments in their engagement with regional and international trade policy processes. She's currently head of trading services in the AFCFTA Secretariat and works on the negotiations and implementation of the agreement on establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. I'm happy I'm not having to spell that out each time. So I'll abbreviate it AFCFTA each time. Now, Ms. Chaito has previously run her own law firm, Chariot 8, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, providing legal services to local, regional, international clients on a range of corporate law matters, including trade, investment, natural resources, and environment. Now, from 2008 to 2010, she worked with international lawyers and economists against poverty, ILEAP program, in providing capacity building support to a number of African regions in their negotiations with the European Union on trade in services under the EPAs, and in defining solutions and strategies for African countries' needs on aid for trade. Now, from 2004 to 2008, Beatrice Chaito was a senior trade policy advisor in the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Sierra Leone on assignment by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Prior to her assignment in Sierra Leone, Beatrice worked for 9 years as senior lawyer and then program director at the Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development in London, building capacity among developing country negotiators at the World Trade Organization. And Ms. Chaito is interested in research and analysis on a range of legal and economic policy issues affecting Africa. She has undertaken assignments for DFID, the European Union Commission, and the UNFAO. She also has private sector interests in horticulture, packaging, design, and well-being. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Beatrice Chaito. Your audience, thank you.
President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Madam Vice President of Sciences, Council and Fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Honorary Secretary, CEO, UMB, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Good evening. On behalf of the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, His Excellency Wamkele Mene, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences for the invitation to give the keynote speech at this year's public forum, whose theme is the African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects, and particularly to introduce the current state of the AFCFTA to the Ghanaian public. Also, I would like to extend congratulations to UMB on their 50th anniversary, wishing UMB all the very best as they move towards the next 50 years of excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by explaining what the African Continental Free Trade Area is. First, it is one of the flagship projects of the African Union's Agenda 2063, a 50-year strategy for achieving equitable and sustainable development. It is an ambitious effort by all African countries to expand intra-African trade by lowering trade barriers to goods and services and enabling movement of people throughout the continent. It covers a market of 1.2 billion people and a GDP of $3.4 trillion across all 55 African states. The AFCFTA represents one of the world's largest free trade areas in terms of numbers of participating countries, second only to the Asia-Pacific's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Second, the AFCFTA is established by a legal treaty, the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was signed into law in March 2018 and entered into force in May 2019. There are currently 54 signatories to the agreement, that is, those that have signaled an intention to be bound by the agreement, with 43 state parties, those that are now legally bound. The agreement currently comprises protocols on trade in goods, trade in services, and dispute settlement. Eventually, the agreement will also include protocols on investment, intellectual property rights, digital trade, as well as women and youth in trade. Third, what is being established through the AFCFTA is a single market that permits the unrestricted movement of people, investment, goods, and services across the African continent, thereby increasing intra-African trade and fostering industrial growth. The start of trading under the AFCFTA was launched on the 1st of January 2021. So greater economic opportunities will be generated for businesses across the state parties, developing a market environment that promotes certainty, predictability, and transparency. In this way, the AFCFTA is much more than a trade agreement. It is, in effect, a development tool to integrate Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the question would be asked, why is intra-African trade a priority? Over the years, the barriers to intra-Africa trade have persisted and have impacted the level of continental development and self-sufficiency. Currently, intra-Africa trade has expanded from about 10% in 1995 to little more than 17% in 2017, woefully low in comparison to levels in Europe at 69%, Asia at 59%, and North America at 31%. African businesses face over 107 unique land borders when trading within the continent. The average tariff encountered by goods crossing these borders is 6.9%. This implies considerable costs for businesses that the AFCFTA can solve. All African countries are members of one or two regional economic agreements, so for instance, ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, etc. However, these RECs have not helped to alleviate the fragmentation and low level of industrialization of African countries. Enter the AFCFTA, which allows economies of scale in production and trade. The UN Economic Commission for Africa projects that the AFCFTA will significantly enhance the value of intra-African trade exports. In 2040, it is expected that simply removing tariffs on goods will raise the value of intra-Africa trade by 15%, or $50 billion, to 25%, or $70 billion, depending on the liberalization efforts, compared to a situation without an AFCFTA. Alternatively, between the start of the AFCFTA, so 2021, and 2040, the share of intra-Africa trade would increase between 40 to 50%, depending on the level of ambition. Furthermore, efforts show that by 2035, if the AFCFTA is implemented successfully, it has the potential to lift millions of Africans out of poverty. These figures demonstrate the AFCFTA's enormous potential for African governments and companies. Consider also that Africa's population is projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050 and will comprise 26% of the world's working age population, with an economy that is estimated to grow twice as rapidly as that of the developed world, with African GDP forecast to grow to $16 trillion by 2060. So, what are the specific opportunities that can be leveraged from the AFCFTA? Under the Protocol on Trade in Goods, we will see elimination of duties and quantitative restrictions on 90% of all tariff lines over 5 years for non-LDCs and 10 years for LDCs. A further 7% of tariff lines that are considered sensitive products will be eliminated over 10 years for non-LDCs and 13 years for LDCs. The application of rules of origin provisions would ensure that SMEs that use significant African content in their products would have those products qualify as originating products eligible under the AFCFTA preferential trade regime in terms of raw materials and value addition. The provisions of the Annex on sanitary and phytosanitary standards entail harmonization of standards, licensing and certification across the continent, making it easier for African business to meet export standards and satisfy regulatory requirements for diverse markets on the continent. Simplifying customs administration and systems under the Customs Cooperation Annex will help streamline procedures for trade, benefiting many informal cross-border traders, and cooperation between customs authorities over product standards and regulations, as well as trade, transit, and facilitation, will make it easier for goods to flow between Africa's borders. Traders that face non-tariff barriers, including burdensome customs procedures or excessive paperwork, will have a mechanism to seek the removal of such burdens in the form of the NTB's online reporting and monitoring mechanism, which will add to the implementation of the provisions in the Annex on NTBs or TBTs, designed to reduce and eliminate NTBs, thus impacting positively on the available market access for African businesses. On trade in services, 5 priority service sectors are being immediately liberalized. That is transport, communication, financial, tourism, and business services. These priority sectors have been selected because they serve as a foundation for all other sectors. Through the opening of the African services market, service suppliers will have access to the markets of all state parties on terms no less favorable than domestic suppliers. Mutual recognition of standards, licensing, and certification of service suppliers will make it easier for businesses and individuals to satisfy the regulatory requirements of operating in each other's markets. The removal of restrictions such as high taxes on foreign companies, strict commercial presence regulations on foreign companies, stringent licensing regimes, etc., will assist also in supporting expansion of trade in goods. Overall, through the commitments made by state parties to remove the restrictions on trade, the time and cost of transacting across borders in Africa will be considerably lowered. This will facilitate the establishment and growth of African businesses on the continent, particularly the growth of small and medium-sized enterprises, and will aid in the ease of integrating into regional and continental value chains. Other opportunities under the AFCFTA include an increase of investment in the region. The opening of new markets and easing of cross-border transactions are expected to increase capital funds and investment in the continent. A better regulatory environment for the growth of African businesses through the harmonization of laws across the continent to facilitate intra-Africa trade. An enabling environment for the sharing of information and best practices across the continent by enhancing common understanding and cooperation in trade-related issues. Cooperation and coordination in the development of regional and continental value chains across the continent. Development of infrastructure through the promotion of research and innovation to accelerate economic and social development. Opportunities for states to diversify goods and services. The AFCFTA effectively is a catalyst for industrial development, placing Africa on a path to exporting value-added products and improving Africa's competitiveness in its own market and globally. And finally, increased level of employment, skills transfer, and inclusivity across the continent through the commitments made under Mode 4 of the Protocol on Trade and Services on the movement of natural persons. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is the current progress in establishing this single market? The Phase 1 negotiations are at an advanced stage. Under trade in goods, 45 member states have submitted their tariff offers, of which 29 offers have been certified as having met the minimum threshold requirement of 90% of the tariff lines, therefore being ready to trade preferentially. For trade in services, 47 member states have submitted their initial and revised trade in services offers, and these are currently being negotiated and finalized to be developed into schedules of specific commitments by the end of June 2022. Under Phase 2 negotiations, the protocols on investment, intellectual property rights, digital trade, and competition policy are currently being drafted and negotiated. The intention is to finalize these negotiations by September 2022. In January this year, in partnership with the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, the Secretariat launched the Pan-African Payment System, PAPS, which will enable convertibility of local currencies for payments under the AFCFTA, amplifying the reduction in transaction costs that will come with reduced tariffs and liberalized services. At the same time, state parties will have access to a $1 billion adjustment fund to cushion any adverse effects on government revenue brought about by the reduction in tariffs and lifting other trade barriers. Ladies and gentlemen, as much progress as we have made, there is always more to do. The ability of the AFCFTA to assist small businesses, which make up close to 90% of African private sector, and the majority of which are headed by women, in adapting to new opportunities and challenges will be critical to the agreement's success, as will the manner in which African policymakers negotiate the terms of the forthcoming AFCFTA legal instruments. Looking at the horizon, in terms of the technological developments we see and how that shapes business operations, the future of employment, etc., presents an obligation to enhance the skills capacities of the African labor force so that they have the competencies necessary to benefit from this agreement. If Africa is to reap the rewards of its demographic dividend, it must invest in its human resources, particularly young women, providing capacity building and training as much as possible. Furthermore, improving the effectiveness of trade facilitation necessitates investments in both soft and hard infrastructure across the free trade area. There are other projects at the continental level, such as the Single African Air Transport Market, SATM, and the Programme for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, that are also aiding in this process. Once the state parties conclude the negotiations, the important task of fully implementing the commitments will fall to each state party, effectively bringing to life the agreement, and by so doing, impacting the lives of every single African citizen. This brings me to the need for the voice of other stakeholders, such as the private sector, civil society, and academia, to continue to be amplified in the processes for negotiation and implementation, so that the AFCFTA is a truly inclusive instrument of regional integration. Let me end by saying, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to acknowledge that the AFCFTA is a gigantic first step in a long journey. The challenges are many, but if we can stay the course, Africa has everything to play for in this bold endeavor to guarantee a prosperous future for its generations to come. The conversations today will be incredibly valuable to us all. And once again, we thank the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences for inviting us to participate in this year's public forum. We believe that everyone in the audience will leave with a better knowledge and understanding of the importance of pursuing the ideal of a single African market under the AFCFTA. Thank you for your attention, and I wish us every success with this very important event.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richis Cato, for starting us off in a great start, giving us a background of what it's all about, AFCFTA. Thank you very much. We'll go straight on to the first topic. And the first topic is promoting structural transformation through intra-African trade. And our speaker for the first topic is Professor Charles Godfrey Acker. So a little background on Professor Acker. Professor Charles Godfrey Acker is an associate professor of economics at the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, ISER, University of Ghana, Legon. He was former head of the economics division of ISER and the immediate past director of the Center for Social Policy Studies. Professor Acker is also an external research fellow with the Center for Research in Economic Development and International Trade, Credit, University of Nottingham in UK. He is also affiliated with the Kiel Center for Globalization, Kiel Institute for World Economy in Germany. Prior to joining the University of Ghana, he worked as a research analyst and consultant at the World Bank, Washington, D.C. His research interests are in empirical international trade and industrial organization focusing. In industrial organization focusing in particular on the activities of multinational companies, foreign direct investment, micro, small, and medium enterprises, and female entrepreneurship. He has published widely in international journals, including the World Bank Economic Review, Journal of Development Studies, Journal of International Development, and Journal of African Business. His research interests are focused on investigating the link between business sustainability and firms' engagement in international trade, the effects that China's growing economic engagement has on African economies and citizens, and the implications of special economic zones for development and social inequality in emerging economies. Prof. Acker has also worked as consultant for, among others, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank, UNIDO, ILO, UNICEF, JICA, Canada's IDRC, UK's DFID, GIZ, and the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research. Prof. Acker is well known in Ghana for his deep insight into real-world and complex micro and macroeconomic challenges and controversies in Africa, and his bold and unbiased policy research and advocacy. Audience, I give you Professor Acker.
Thank you very much, Professor Chair.
the President of the Academy and the Vice Presidents of the Academy, Fellows of the Academy, past President and Vice Presidents, distinguished guests on the high table, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be invited to be part of this forum and to speak on the topic promoting structural transformation through intra-Africa trade. I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation, but you permit me to read the paper that I was invited to write, which I only finished this afternoon. My outline will be on 3 to 5 main issues, as time will allow. I would like to talk about exactly what is structural transformation, how do we define it, and how has Africa performed in that metric. I'll provide some stylized facts of trade and industrialization in Africa, where I seek to compare Africa with East Asia. I would like to talk a bit about industrialization as a key for harnessing the benefits of the AFCFTA. I will now talk about how the AFCFTA provides unique opportunity for Africa to transform the economies and the continent. I'll conclude with some policy options for consideration for the African governments and the institutions that are in charge of trade. Let me start with a quote by Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe said that there is nothing basically wrong with the Nigerian character, and for that matter, there's nothing wrong with the African. There's nothing wrong with the Nigerian land or climate or water or air or anything else. The Nigerian problem is the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility of true leadership. Unquote. Africa remains the world's least industrialized region and at the same time the poorest region on the globe. One of the puzzling sights in many African cities and towns is the sheer numbers of young, energetic people who are engaged in risky, informal commerce on the streets, especially at the traffic lights and road intersections, trying to sell largely cheap imported goods to passers-by and pedestrians, even on Sundays. And sometimes one would spot them in thunderstorm, even yesterday, persistent and undeterred by the dangers. Never mind that they make only an average of perhaps just $5 a day. The fact is that there's a complete incongruity between the glory and the virtue to which Africa is ordained and blessed by God on the one hand, and the economic and social condition of Africa on the other. The policy question is, how is this incongruity to be resolved and this impossibility overcome? In this paper, I argue that Africa's economy has not performed well for 2 major reasons: bad political governance or lack of transformational leadership, and marginalization from globalization and international trade. Africa needs accelerated growth and appropriate structural transformation or structural change in order to develop, create decent jobs, and deliver the bulk of its population out of poverty. In development theory, structural transformation, broadly defined, is a process of reallocation of economic activity across 3 broad sectors of the agriculture, the manufacturing, which is the most productive sector of the industrial sector. The industrial sector includes the mining and quarrying and construction, but manufacturing is key when we are talking about structural transformation of an economy. And then the third is the services sector, i.e. structural transformation involves moving economic activity from the low productivity or the traditional sector, which is usually the agriculture sector, into the higher productivity or what we call the modern sector, which is the manufacturing sector. Most research on economic development started with this question: what is the nature and the determinants of structural change or structural transformation? Lewis and Kuznets were pioneers of this research. The main determinants of the nature and the structure of structural transformation are industrial trade policies implemented by the various governments. The importance of industrial development in bringing about the needed structural transformation of African economies cannot be overemphasized. Africa needs to industrialize to meet the development aspirations of its people and to create high-quality jobs and prosperity for all. And this is acknowledged by the African Development Bank itself. This is the only sure way of creating progressively the conditions for the realization of the long-term objectives of self-reliant and self-sustained development, which many African countries were hoping for after independence. Industrial policy is at the heart of economic development, and that active industrial production sector development policies must be at the heart of an appropriate development strategy in Africa. The major policy focus of that strategy should, therefore, be on Africa's strategic and competitive participation in international trade, which depends on the competitiveness of made-in-Africa goods in domestic, regional, and international markets. Economists have assigned a very strong weight to the role of international trade and international exposure more generally in the analysis of long-term development and industrialization experiences of countries. There have been numerous papers in this direction, including some of the ones I have written myself over the last 15 years. Many growth theoreticians and econometricians consistently hypothesize an important role for trade in explaining observed variations in national growth rates across countries and continents and over time. Governmental policies toward trade have therefore also been featured in such historical, theoretical, and empirical investigations of growth and development. Trade policy recommendations have thus become prominent in normative analysis of current development problems in the developing countries, and indeed everywhere else. More particularly, many analyses of the East Asian successes of the 1970s and 80s had called attention to the importance therein of active industrial trade policies by their governments. In contrast, many African countries have experienced, and some are still experiencing, terrible mismanagement. Ineffective leadership is principally responsible for the underdevelopment and poverty on the continent. Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986, once lamented, and is instructive for me to quote him: "African dreams of peace and prosperity have been shattered by the greedy, corrupt, and unscrupulous rule of African strongmen. One would contend with just a modest cleaning of the environment, development of opportunities, health services, education, eradication of poverty. But unfortunately, even these modest goals are thwarted by a power-crazed and rapacious leadership who can only obtain their egotistical goals by oppressing the rest of us, unquote. Regrettably, Africa has been marginalized in world trade for quite too long. There's now an open admission that the status quo portends dire consequences in face of the demographic dividend with very strong, young, energetic ladies and gentlemen on the continent. Recent discussions have centered on Africa's regional integration as an opportunity for African countries with similar levels of development to trade and derive mutual benefits from the gains of trade. Stronger African regional cooperation through an effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area is expected to unlock new opportunities for diversification and trade. Among others, the AfCFTA is aimed at boosting intra-African trade and harmonizing the heterogeneity of trade rules across the regional economic communities and under regional trade agreements. The AfTA is aimed at addressing a situation whereby intra-African exports often face higher tariffs within the continent than in the rest of the world, partly due to preferential trade arrangements. It is anticipated that its establishment could also lead to the reorientation of trade towards the regional market, leading to a significant overall output, gains in welfare, and employment expansion in the long term, as the first speaker just told us. The question I pose in this paper is how can African countries promote structural transformation through intra-Africa trade on the back of the AfCFTA? How is structural transformation measured? Developing economies have measured industrialization or structural transformation by the manufacturing value added share in GDP or by manufacturing employment share in total employment. In his Nobel Prize lecture, Kuznets, 1973, refers to structural change or industrialization as a phenomenon characterized, among others, by the massive shift of labor away from agriculture as one of the 6 main features of modern economies. By way of illustration, the agriculture share of employment declined from 75% to less than 3% between 1800 and the year 2000 in the United States. 75% of all United States citizens were involved in the agriculture sector, and by 2000, only 3% of Americans are involved in the agriculture sector to feed the Americans and to export some of their goods to Africa. The agriculture share of output also fell from the United States from 40% to just 1% between 1840 and the year 200. So agriculture was controlling about 40% of GDP, but it now controls just about 1%, leaving the rest for the manufacturing sector and the service sector to absorb. In a recent paper by Kaba and others, they define structural change as the reallocation of economic activity between agriculture and manufacturing using the ratio that I would like to show you, if you can see from far. Structural transformation or structural change for any country I in any time period T is a ratio between the manufacturing value added or the share of manufacturing in total gross domestic product over the share of agriculture value added. This is very instructive, and I will show you a few statistics later on. So in any country that seeks to transform, you will expect that the manufacturing sector of that country should contribute more to GDP and more to employment than the agriculture, which is the traditional, less productive sector. Where this ratio is more than 1, it means that the country is transforming in the right direction. Structural change is taking place, and the country is progressing, and there will be employment, and there will be a lot of productivity. Where that ratio is less than 1, it means that the country is still transforming, but it's transforming in the wrong direction. It means that people are rather moving from the manufacturing sector because it's collapsing, or because of bad policies, to the traditional sector, which is the agriculture sector, or to mining or any other sectors, or even to services. I can tell you that that ratio is 0.5 for Ghana, which means that we are moving in the wrong direction. And it's also about 0.5 for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. It is 2.25% for Malaysia and most of the East Asian economies. So they have been transforming in the right direction, moving from tradition to the modern sector, or from the agriculture to the manufacturing sector. Some stylized facts I would like to show you briefly as I go on. If you can see this graph, it's just illustrating the development trends in terms of GDP per capita over the last 3 or so decades. You can track this back to the independence era, and you will see that the Ghana is at the bottom, is the one at the bottom, where GDP per capita is still very, very low and has not caught up over the last 3-4 decades. And on top of those, you will see Singapore, and you will see Hong Kong, and you see South Korea, and you will see even Malaysia, which was our equal in 1957-60. And you also see that the gaps are widening as we are going over time, so which makes it very difficult for Ghana or Sub-Saharan Africa to catch up, because these countries are not waiting for us. So the question is, what could account for such gross differences between these economies? Could it be the nature and the scope of production and consumption and trade? I suggest so. If you go to figure 2, you will see, next figure please, you will see, if you could see, this is the sectoral share of gross domestic product. And I take Ghana as a typical African country, the first country to attain political independence in 1957, and one of Africa's star economies, probably apart from South Africa and recently Rwanda. And you will see that for each bar, you see the contribution of agriculture, forestry and fishing, and then industry in the middle, and then services on top. And what you will notice, if you dig deeper, is that over these years, since structural adjustment from 1984 all the way to 2019, you will see that clearly the structural change is going the wrong direction. You see signs of deindustrialization, which means that the industry used to contribute more to the GDP in time past, even in the 80s, than it is doing now. Many of the factories in Africa, many of the industries in Ghana have just been left to collapse, to the extent that manufacturing's contribution to GDP and to employment is very, very, very small at this point. And yet you see that the services sector has overtaken both the manufacturing sector and then the agriculture sector, which again I call premature tertiarization or premature servicification. It's premature because it did not go through what you were expected to see in any typical situation, where the country should have moved from agriculture, abundant production of food and raw materials, linked to an industrial sector that picks those raw materials to industrialize and create jobs into finished products. And then you will now see a service tertiary sector which now provides the insurance, the transportation, communication, the finances to help these sectors. In our part of Africa, We just jump people from primary to tertiary without going through that secondary or manufacturing sector. So the service sector actually is servicing the service sector mainly. Most of the things that are happening is services, servicing, trade, and commerce, nothing more. If you go to the next figure, you see even a more dire situation. Here in each of the bars, you see the various components of agriculture and the various components of industry and the various components of the service sector. And you will see clearly that the manufacturing sector, I don't have a pointer, which is the smallest, has actually declined and almost finished in the, but it's 1, 2, 3, the third, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the third from the top in that bar, and it's gone almost finished. And you will see that what is happening is the mining sector growing substantially over time, and you will see that the service sector also growing substantially over time, and you see some trade services also growing over time, including the financial services and the transport services and business services and government services. And the agriculture sector has declined, and so is the manufacturing sector. The share of agriculture declined from 5% in Korea and less than 10% in Malaysia, and it stands now at about 20%. But that in Africa, you will see that that share of agriculture is still quite high. The next slide actually shows us the trends in agriculture value added. This is telling us what is going on in the agriculture sector. What you will see that in 1960, almost all the countries were around 40% of GDP, and there have been a sharp decline over the last 4 or so decades to just about 10% for most of the Asian countries, Malaysia, Korea, and even for the rest of the world. It's only in Africa that even though we have witnessed a decline in agriculture share of GDP, it's still around 20%, more than twice what it is in other countries. If you go to the next slide, you will see manufacturing value added, the key sector. And you see that in 1960, almost all the countries, Korea, Malaysia, Sub-Saharan Africa as a region, and Ghana, were around 10% of manufacturing value added. You will see a sharp, dramatic increase in East Asia, in Malaysia and Korea, moving from about 10% to around 25% of GDP, which is they're industrializing. Whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's actually a decline from around 17, 18% in 1980, and is now just around 10%. And so is Ghana's own. Actually, there was during the period of structural adjustment in 1980-83, it went almost to negative, and then now began to rise, but is still nowhere near catching up with the East Asians. The next slide is showing you what is happening in employment in agriculture. Around 1990, there were almost 60% of total employment in Ghana was in agriculture sector. In Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, it was just around 20%. That's even just about 2-3 decades ago. Over time, in the last 3 decades, the agriculture contribution to employment has declined in these countries to just around 10% and 5% and almost 0% in Singapore. There's almost nobody in agriculture in Singapore except just about 1%, still feeding the Singaporean economy and exporting. In Africa, and epitomized by Ghana, it has declined, but it's still around 30%. Almost a third of all people employed in Ghana are in the agriculture sector, yet it has not received the adequate investment, and productivities there are quite low, small scale, 1 acre gardens. In parallel to this development in the structure of production, African countries have experienced perverse developments in the nature and structure of international trade. A large part of the growth of the last few decades has been propelled by booming prices of its main commodity exports. Notably, no serious effort has been made in Africa in recent times to use the recent commodity-based growth to start a more sustainable growth path based on the development of the manufacturing sector, including not exclusively the processing of primary commodities. It is quite ironic that for all these decades since independence from colonial rule, several African economies continue to export raw primary commodities with limited upgrading within the value chain. Example, making cocoa butter and powder instead of exporting cocoa beans. Simple things like that. As such, the growth performance thus far remains highly vulnerable to external shocks and is not translated into meaningful job creation. In figures 7 to 11, I show you the trade performance in Africa, where AFCFTA will need to play a very significant role. Those graphs document the trends in the structure of trade in Africa and East Asia. And one thing that is clear in all those graphs I'll soon show you is that in many East Asian economies, they have attained high manufacturing output shares, while Africa has not attained so. Asian targets like China, Thailand, Malaysia, all targeted export-oriented light manufacturing in their march towards economic transformation. Today, while close to 3/4 of Thailand's exports are manufactures, almost 70%, less than 1/4 of Africa's exports, only about 5.2% of Ghana's exports are manufactured goods. Africa's trade with the rest of the world is growing, especially with Asia in recent times. However, this trade has mainly been driven by the exploitation and export of primary products, chiefly natural resources. A large part of the Africa's economic performance of the last 2 decades has been propelled by booming prices of main commodity exports: gold, cocoa, manganese, bauxite. Thus far, trade has not had the desired effects on employment and the creation of jobs and on human development. Many observers point to the need to diversify the African economies towards high productivity activities in manufacturing. For instance, Nigeria, Africa's largest economy and oil exporter, has adversely been affected by the negative oil price shock, with government revenue falling from about 7.6% of GDP in 2015 to just about 4% in 2016, representing more than 70% decline from the peak of 17% in 2011. Indeed, Nigeria's GDP growth rate dropped substantially from 2.37% in 2015 to a negative 1.5% in 2016. That's how vulnerable the African economies are, because of the nature of the kind of things they trade and the types of markets, concentrated markets in Europe, that they have focused their exports into. In the next slides, you will see, as I try to conclude, all those slides, if you get the paper, you will see maybe the next one, manufactured exports. And you will see that if you look at manufactured exports, all the top countries exporting almost 70 to 90% of manufactures, which means that almost 90% of all exports from Singapore to the rest of the world are manufactured goods. They are goods that have gone through processing and value addition, creating jobs thereby. The same for Malaysia, Hong Kong. And in Africa and Ghana, you will see that we are just around 5%, just still at the bottom. Only about 5% of our exports are any value added. It's still oil and gold and cocoa beans. And this needs to change with after. Now, how should Africa promote structural transformation if this is the start story? Can Africa industrialize still? Yes, it can. Indeed, it should. Still, industrialization remains critically important to Africa's transformation. Since the Industrial Revolution, almost every country that has managed to transition from low to high income has undergone industrialization, especially in Asia, in their low income stage of development. Indeed, no country in the world, except a few exceptionally rich in oil, like Qatar, Kuwait, and Brunei, only this, or very small financial havens like Monaco, Liechtenstein, has achieved high and sustainable standards of living without developing a significant manufacturing sector. No other country has done that. So if Africa does not industrialize, or Ghana does not industrialize, our problem will persist till Christ comes. During the 19th century, several countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America experienced a process of deindustrialization, which is the decline of the industrial sector, or a contraction in manufacturing. Their total share in world manufacturing fell from about 60.5% in 1830 to just about 7.5% by 1913. This was essentially during the colonial era. One of Africa's problems is because of colonization, but we need to break out of that. During the colonial era, the system was so perverse that it characterized a massive global investment in the natural resources of the African economies and a concentration of the global manufacturing investment in Europe and the United States, taking away our natural resources, going to add value to them and bringing it back to us. That's what took place for several years. Confronted with such a dire situation of deindustrialization in 1950s and 60s, many of the East Asian countries decided to change and do something dramatic and unorthodox. They resorted to industrial and trade policies actively supported by their government. In the main, they opted to invest and to support with subsidies and provide necessary infrastructure for their domestic countries to be able to break out of the colonial inheritance. Mostly, countries began to export agricultural raw materials and then gradually upgraded in significant share of their exports into labor-intensive manufacturing goods and later into capital-intensive manufacturing products. Similarly, in Africa, most governments showed a strong interest in industrialization, like Kwame Nkrumah did, and all the factories that he set since 1960. A distinguishing characteristics between Africa's development paradigm and that of Asia is that in Africa, the motive was basically to replace every import that was coming from Europe and to begin to do them here when the capacity was not there. So instead of growing on the back of the export of raw materials and start agro-industrialization and adding value to them to boost the agriculture sector and then to have the agro-based industries and begin to now export to the region and to the world, they tried to do almost the impossible. These policies were greeted with some kind of dynamism initially. However, errors in macroeconomic policy and unexpected changes in terms of trade caused balance of payment deficit and shortages of foreign exchange, and domestic inflation combined with exchange controls led to an overvalued exchange rates in almost all African countries, which damaged exports and fueled a vicious cycle of foreign currency shortages, controls, and overvalued exchange rates. As I try to conclude, how do we move on with this after now, with this background and history? Africa needs to promote agriculture-based industrialization. There's a need for a paradigm shift in Ghana and in Africa. Africa needs to mount an aggressive push for agriculture, investment, and for exporting. This is what I call an offensive trade strategy. Mind you, trade is a game. Trade is like football. In any game, you need a plan and you need a strategy to win. What is sad is that in most African countries, they are trading without a plan and without a strategy. And therefore, it's very difficult for you to determine what is their goal on the field. If you take a football match, for example, you will have what we call the attackers, which are those that are prepared, trained, equipped to score at every least opportunity. Those in trade parlance are what we call the exporting firms. So African countries need to now identify selectively which factories or which sectors or which industries have capacity to score goals. To score goals means that they have capacity to export and to break into the world market, regionally and globally. Such players need to be supported. They need to be given the subsidy. They need to be located in economic processing zones. They need to have agglomeration effect, to be provided with all the necessary finances, tax incentives, all that they need to be able to produce, to export, and to compete with Chinese products all over the world. Not every industry can do that, but there are some people who are skillful and they have what it takes to score goals. On the other hand, in any football match, there are people who are defenders. Theirs is to prevent a goal from being scored. They can never score a goal, they will waste a penalty. In trade, such are the industries we call the import substituting industrialized countries. Those firms, their aim is to protect the Ghanaian market or the African market. They are to produce the things that we used to import. The things that are coming from China and coming from Asia and coming from America, the poultry waste that are being imported and consumed here, we have such firms that need to compete. They need to be supported. They need to be enhanced. They need to be given all they need to produce for the domestic market and to stop every import from coming that is not necessary. And government needs to actively place taxes, tariffs on making sure that they are competitive. And this is done all over in the world and consistent with WTO rules. President Trump did it. Germany is doing it. Every country do it to be competitive. It's not wrong. Of course, in the middle are those that we call the maestros. These are the midfielders. These are firms that can both export and can also serve into the domestic market. Government also needs to give them some support. And that is the industrial strategy that we need to pursue. I am signaled to try to conclude. I have no doubt that the manufacturing sector is the right sector for Africa to focus on if Africa is going to transform. However, this must not happen in a laissez-faire attitude. Rather, we need an active industrial policy. In fact, the success stories of all the well-performing Asian tigers, like Malaysia and China, and that of Brazil, were actually success stories of industrial policy. For example, oil palm is not native to Malaysia. Oil palm, actually, I'm told, was picked from Ghana. But the industry has been deliberately promoted and supported by government and industrial policy, which started as far back as the 1960s, when government tried to diversify its traditional export base of tin and rubber. Palm oil was one of the first industries picked by the Malaysian government and still one of the priority industries in Malaysia as a sector that has linkages across the whole country. Ghana can follow a similar path by the state promoting export-oriented agro-based manufacturing industries by incentivizing manufacturers with new legislations granting duty-free imports of inputs for manufactured exports in certain critical product categories. This is what Mauritius did also in 1970, that they now export sugar and textile all over the world. They had to support the production and transformation of sugarcane. Regrettably, most African countries have let agriculture, their most important sector in terms of food security and poverty, to decline prematurely through a lack of adequate investment, over-taxation, and wrong-headed policies. And what is the way forward? In conclusion, according to the standard economic theory that we have studied, the structural change has not yet happened in Africa yet in the right direction, and hopefully AFTA will provide the opportunity. The role of the state as a leader, a catalyst, and a supporter of economic development was critical in East Asia. Asia's experience illustrates that trade openness or AFTA alone will not do anything. Only when it is complemented by strategic action and effective industrial policy can it work and deliver the expected outcome. African governments must learn these lessons from the past failed attempts and the successes from East Asia and do the right thing. Intra-Africa trade is essential for Africa to realize its full potential. Africa needs to improve the policy environment for industry. It's too costly to do business in Africa. Africa needs to also try to move away and try to improve the legal environment and all the things that stifle doing business. Secondly, African government needs to activate the potential for innovation and technological innovation and processes. Thirdly, for AFTA to work, African government needs to invest in the development of adequate fiscal infrastructure, including regional transport links and energy and telecommunication networks across the region, together with institutions to maintain them. Poor infrastructure has been cited so many times as a critical barrier to progress in Africa. African road densities, for instance, are the lowest in the world. Regional road and rail networks are too often in a poor state, and this needs to change. Fourthly, and last but one, Africa governments must invest more in vocational and technical training to close the skills gap. The way to benefit from AFTA is not more primary and secondary school graduates. Several African entrepreneurs and multinational companies cite lack of skills as a major obstacle which have kept firms in Africa from being competitive. There's a dearth of production-related skills on the continent, and this requires a deliberate government policy to retool the instant educational system. It's sad that polytechnics have been made universities. It's very regrettable. And finally, African governments must bear in mind the complexity of relationships among the policies. My own research over the last years has shown that AFTA will not benefit every African country. For example, if a country reduces its trade barriers, it is the richest African countries that will benefit first, but all other countries, if they do the right thing, also stand to benefit in the long run. In conclusion, what Africa needs is another Joseph, a youth, small, young, smart leader that in the times of ancient Egypt, when the country was facing famine, was standing before Pharaoh and told Pharaoh to look out for a man discreet and wise and to set him over the land of Egypt and let him appoint officers of the land to take up a fifth of the part of the Egypt food, which was plenteous in 7 years, and to let them gather the food in those years and lay up corn. And he kept them in those times that after the 7 years of plenty, when there was such famine all over the world, Africa or Egypt at the time was able to feed the rest of the world. How can a small Ukraine affect the whole of Africa in terms of export of wheat and corn and some foodstuffs? When an African continent so blessed with land and with so much resources could have been feeding the rest of the world and even manufacture some and export some and keep some. Can we find such a one as a man in whom the Spirit of God is so discreet, so wise, that will be able to take African leadership and deliver Africa from poverty? I thank you so sincerely for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Aka. You've really given us a lot of food for thought. Our second topic The African Continental Free Trade Area, Implications for Private Sector Development, will be given by Mr. David Ofosu-Dorte, Senior Partner, AB and David Africa. Now a little bit on Mr. David Ofosu-Dorte. David Ofosu-Dorte is the founder and senior partner of AB and David Africa, a Pan-African law firm with independent offices in 6 countries and a network of firms in 24 African countries. His experience cuts across 3 decades of lead advisory role in public policy development and implementation, structural deal structuring, infrastructure deal structuring, construction contracts advice, public-private partnerships, project finance, and the power sector. He is described as highly regarded and exceptionally strong in ensuring that client requirements are delivered. He always brings innovation to issues due to his wide experience internationally. Aside his regular law practice, he is a passionate Pan-Africanist and an executive of the Afro-Champions organization, which has spearheaded several Pan-African private sector initiatives, including the Private Sector $1 Trillion Africa Investment Framework for Africa in support of the AFCFTA, which has since been adopted by the Africa Union. He co-led the Afro-Champions team that mobilized private sector actions from 28 African countries for private sector action ahead of the start of AFCFTA. He also recently led a study commissioned by a major development finance institution on how to pilot legislation that will promote the emergence and expansion of export trading companies in 8 African countries, including Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire. In addition to law, David also holds a master's degree in public administration, a master's in applied business research, and is also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, UK. He has served for many years on the governing council of the Association of Ghana Industries. Between 2013 and 2014, David had the distinction to serve as a committee member of the National Competitiveness Council of Nigeria as a non-Nigerian member. He has delivered numerous lectures on how the private sector may benefit from the AFCFTA. So audience, our final speaker, David Ofosu-Dorte. Thank you.
Forward or backwards? No. That's the point. No. The arrow up and down. Okay. The president of the academy, vice president of the academy, fellows and members of the academy, fellow speaker, and other distinguished members of the audience, including the young academics I see in the audience. It's my privilege to speak to you over the next 30 to 40 minutes or so. I'll try and make it shorter if possible, but that was the time I was given on the topic of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, implications for private sector development. I know this is the Academy of Arts and Sciences, so the paper will be given to you later, but I'll share some slides, a lot of which are pictorial, and speak to it so that we can relate to it. Having said that, I think Beatrice from the After Secretariat has already spoken, so I'm not going to go into the details regarding what AFTA or AFCFTA is, except to say that it's, just wanted to be sure we were synchronizing, that is supposed to create a larger market from the 55 countries, and many people made the mistake of talking about Africa being 54 countries. The AU recognizes 55 countries, so I just want to be clear about that. And bringing them together creates a larger market. Tariff-free, duty-free, a lot of which has been talked about. Value addition, which Professor Chansaka has also talked about. Disease restriction in exports, to mention a few. But we must, I must set the tone by mentioning or emphasizing the fact that the AFCFTA itself is part of the various programs under Agenda 2063. That's a very important part, even though it tends to be the most popular of the Agenda 2063 activities. The reason I say so is that the other collateral things that will make the AFCFTA work, and I'll come to private sector development shortly. So for example, the single air transport market, which requires about 15 countries to make it operational, unlike the AFCFTA itself, which required 22. And from the last of my check, the SATAM has not attained that 15. But if it does, you will see that free movement of goods and people would drop the cost of transportation, especially by air. And if that is added to logistics spared by sea transport, and remember about 16 countries in Africa are landlocked, it may boost intra-Africa trade much faster. But having said that, based on the literature you read, some say Africa's GDP is 2.5 trillion. The AFCFTA Secretary General Secretariat has used 3.6, which I heard Beatrice repeat, and I will like to use that. I prefer that to 2.5, obviously. But more importantly, I like to use the 6.6 trillion purchase power parity, which is actually the better way to measure a country's or a continent's size. So by all indications, if you use purchase power parity, Africa is actually has a large economy, provided it were working together. And AFCFTA, for want of a better example, is estimated to add about $450 billion to that over the next 10 years. So this, what we are talking about, is significant, provided we can have it done. Now, what do I mean by private sector? Because we are talking about private sector development. I want to define it very simple. Private sector to me means anything which is not for the state and therefore commercial in character, or which is for the state and commercial in character. So even if I'm talking about private sector, the SOEs are private sector by my definition for this presentation. The second baseline I want to give for the talk has to do with private sector development, which I will use two operating words: growth and competitiveness. To the extent that the private sector is growing and competitiveness means competitive as compared to other private sector entities from other countries. So these two operating words define what I mean by private sector and what I mean by growth. And it is along this line the next set of my discussions will deal with. Now, by courtesy of Afro Champions organization, which I belong to in my nightlife, I will share some few data, and the data relates to what is trending, and by what is trending, what was actually trending before the AFCFTA and what is continuing to trend as we speak. And remember, I'm from the private sector, so I would like to use figures and things that relate to how the private sector sees things, relating especially to money and the ability to tap into opportunity. So, I think I have not moved the slide, apologies. Yes, okay. Now, what is trending? Let me pick a few examples. If you take food, which again, Prof has done a lot of justice to, you will notice that Africa urban food imports, and I'm talking about food imports from outside Africa, was trending around $35 billion before the AFCFTA's launch. This is about 2016, and was projected to hit $110 billion by 2025. That's how much food we are importing. And further projected to hit about $150 billion by 2030. Now, this data is important because it relates to the ability to tap into the opportunity. And if you relate it to increasing Africanization, and I like to keep things simple, the fact that people are increasingly moving away from things which are canned and imported to things like Cocoa Express or Wache Express, and the local things, provided it is properly packaged, it will show that the ability of the private sector to tap into this potential. Now, if you move to irrigation, which will be the basis for multiplying the output of agric, the expenditure there alone is about $65 billion, and it's projected to grow. Total agri spending in terms of need for smallholder financing is trending around $450 billion. This is pre-AFCFTA figures I'm giving you. Now let's move on to another. Why is it on? Okay, good. Right. Movement of goods and people. The aviation sector alone was trending around $200 billion, again, pre-AFCFTA, and provides a big opportunity to tap into. So if you talk about SATAM working, that's the single air transport market, that changes the dynamics. Education, $259 billion. Now, you will find that countries like Ghana and Nigeria attract a lot of intra-African movements when it comes to studying across borders. I think Ghana generally attracts a bit more in that direction. And this figure, $259 billion, includes also related health activities. And Ghana and Nigeria tend to trend in West Africa a lot about health tourism, which we've not been able to capitalize on. If you have a free market, it's much easier to actually ensure that you take advantage of that, because there is no homogeneity when it comes to taking advantage of the AFCFTA, and we tend to think everything is about just goods and export of physical goods. So I'm giving this data to show the broad spectrum by which benefit can take place. Manufacturing is expected to hit $1 trillion by 2030. Unfortunately, COVID and our inability to take advantage of COVID, and by that I'm talking about where you had supply chains being blocked and our inability to strategize properly to be able to shift supply chains to Africa, unfortunately has affected us. Clothing, which you see on the slide, you have a situation where by 2030, the amount of people to clothe will move from 1.27 billion to 1.6 billion people. And again, the trend I want to point out to is an increasing desire to wear made in Africa clothes. And that has quite a lot of significance. That is why when we were young, the people we used to call seamstresses and tailors are now fashion designers, and the amount of value has actually gone up. It's our ability to let this be converted into real value, which is what is important. And if AFCFTA properly structured, should make it easy for somebody sitting in Kenya to decide to wear kente type of clothes from Ghana and vice versa. Okay, combined consumer spending, projected consumer spending is about 2.5 trillion. Combined consumer spending is expected to hit $4 trillion by 2030. Now, this is important also, apart from the fact that it adds to purchase power parity, it also affects the ability to tap into the AFCFTA, provided we are trending towards consuming what we have here. Again, let me use Ghana as an example. I travel around Africa a lot. I do not know any African country which has got more diverse cuisine than Ghana. And I say this sincerely, I know Africa quite well. But we are unable to translate this cuisine into the type that the hotels will sell, just like the way the Chinese have been able to sell their cuisine around the world. And again, that's how I see AFCFTA in very simple terms. Because once you can translate your cuisine, it makes it easier to open Ghanaian restaurants, as an example, around the rest of Africa. Now, megacities, 17 cities in Africa are on the megacities list, and that's more than half the megacities currently trending worldwide. That means that these cities have got more than 5 million people. Accra is one of them. Now, if you bring this data down to normal cities, 1 million plus, that's 52 of them in Africa alone. Connecting these cities creates a lot of need for infrastructure, which creates its own demand and its own investment structure as well. So for example, whereas the World Bank estimated in 2012 that Africa needs $93 billion to, as it were, per annum to meet the infrastructure gap, the African Development Bank by 2017 had proved that we actually did $170 billion, more than double the amount, or about double the amount, making it $1.7 trillion. Unfortunately, if this is not properly structured and proper economic and financial modeling done to ensure that the financing is largely private sector led, one, two, that it is not leading to trending to export the dollar out of Africa, because the more you actually fund this from dollar denominated contractors and dollar denominated transactions, it puts pressure on the dollar, and worst of all, it leads to the debt to GDP ratio if it is actually overfunded by the public sector. And the $1 trillion framework, which I was privileged to co-lead, which as indicated, has been adopted by the AU, provides a solution as to how we will approach this. And it's possible to actually solve the infrastructure problem without necessarily burdening or putting the burden on government purse. What are some of the impacts that I expect from this, and speaking as a private sector person myself, and as somebody whose full-time business is to advise the private sector? So I take this across both short, medium, and long term. First, I expect a massive change in the ecosystem. And we need to recognize that. What do I mean by the ecosystem? Previously, the private sector would be dealing with just government, regulators, banks, etc. But with the AFCFTA, the After Secretariat, for example, become a significant part of the ecosystem. How rules of origin are organized becomes part of the ecosystem. You will find that coordinating with National Secretariat of the AFCFTA, for example, Ghana's National Secretariat becomes part of the ecosystem. You will find that export trading companies, which Professor Charles Akari alluded to, becomes a significant component of the ecosystem. I had the privilege of leading an assignment for a DFI that has looked at the possibility of replicating, or in an African way, the ETCs, as we would like to call it. And the interesting perspective that is worth talking about, and these will all become part of the ecosystem. Of course, you also find that if AFCFTA should work, one of the impacts will be that there should be a new breed of businesses in the line of what I call aggregators and consolidators, who currently do not exist except in the likes of Cocoa Board. Now, these are canneling agencies who can take the natural way that we do things as well as small producers and consolidate it, provided we are producing to the same standard, so we can meet the export volumes. One of the things I keep drawing attention to is that it is not everybody who intends to grow big, and not everybody who has the capacity to be able to upscale. But we need to distinguish upscaling from upgrading. Upgrading, which is about quality, and consolidating it can be a significant way. And that is one way we can marry the SMEs into the value chain and take advantage of the AFCFTA without having to ask all of them to spend huge amounts of money, borrow, and then necessarily get from the agric to the fourth industrial revolution. So these are things we need to think about. And there are countries which have done these things. This will affect how the ecosystem works. And of course, we have agencies like the GRA who may need to rethink their approach to businesses when it comes to the ecosystem. The other important aspect of the impact will be the need for us to rethink what competitiveness means. And rethink competitiveness means that we may need to look at cost of capital as against inflation indexing. And I may probably return to this particular point. How banks, and I've seen UMBs here, they may be better in a better position to explain that, price their loans. And for me, it's very simple. If on a free market, one continent free market, if the lending rate in Kenya is 12% and that in Ghana is already trending above 25%, you are not competitive. And that's how we have to be thinking. Those are the facts of life that we need to look at. We also have to rethink how we overlook domestic investments as a trigger for foreign direct investments. And again, because there isn't much time, I will move on that. I may return to it briefly, but if I don't during question time, I'll be prepared to elaborate on what I mean by that. Then, the non-marketing mindset of the Ghanaian entrepreneur in particular. We just don't market, and we forget that marketing requires occupying a certain mind share of the product, of the persons who consume the product. And if our businesses don't take the step of occupying a significant mind share, then no matter how much we produce, it is competing on an open market that those who occupy a greater mind share will sell their products. And that's a very important thing that the private sector needs to realize. The other entity that I talk about once as in a while when I get the opportunity is the legislature. And the problem is not exactly with the legislature, but the entire approach where we do not realize the impact of legislations we make. There are legislations existing, and some of them that we will continue making without analyzing its impact will undermine the very thing we seek to achieve with the AFCFTA. And there are several examples of this. In fact, there are legislation in this country which actually prevent entities from growing. a recent one was passed, which actually bans what we call limited liability partnerships. It's an indirect way of saying that certain service sectors cannot grow. That's what it actually means, in simple terms. And in a free trade environment where trade in services is being introduced, it's actually a backward way of looking at things. Now, there's the third point, strategic action we need to take regarding the rules of origin. At times, the FTA is simplified by simply saying 90% of goods will be liberalized, 7% may be sensitive, and 3% may be excluded. Okay. One of the things that, and again, Beatrice is here, she may want to clarify that if what I'm saying is not the position. But one of the things which is not said is that you cannot necessarily put your goods in a sensitive sector if you are importing a significant part of it. Now, having said that, Nigeria's decision, for example, to ban the importation of rice is a strategic action. It may not necessarily be what they would have intended, but currently, Nigeria imports almost next to nothing. Whilst Ghana must, even though we have an advantage to actually put rice in a sensitive category, we import so much rice that under the AFCFTA, we cannot do that. So at times, it is not just the AFCFTA, but the strategy you use in order to attain the advantage which the AFCFTA gives you. And again, these are the ways that I think private sector must be looking at things. My impact number 4 I see is leveraging competitiveness itself by creating forward and backward linkages in the AFCFTA. And one of the best ways we can do that is to use foundation minerals. Foundation minerals, which a lot of which we do have, are the type of things which, if we go for the value addition, can create a multiplier effect. A lot has been talked about regarding bauxite and its relation value addition, which I know the current government is doing something about. I'm quite familiar with what is happening. But the ability to add that to salt creates a bigger advantage than we can currently have. And what I mean by salt is adding the salt's potential to produce chlorine and caustic soda. And it changed the entire dynamics. There are a lot of studies have been done in this sector in Ghana, some of which project that the nation can be getting about $1.03 trillion over the next 50 years from that sector alone. And it's because Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Liberia are about the only countries on the West Coast which can produce salt in commercial quantities. And salt combined with petrochemical industry can completely revolutionize the economy. But if you notice, there's a lot of fights over the salt, and those are things that we are not solving, and we are not realizing its impact on the private sector. I've already talked about cost of capital and access to capital. But one point worth emphasizing has to do with the fact that by our very location in the West Africa sub-region, and indeed in the world, I have said enough about that. If you Google it, it's online, and these days I hear a lot of public entities talk about it, the whole idea about center of the world concept, which I think is one of the things we wasted. As an aside, I have made this comment over and over. This nation spent millions of dollars, including monies borrowed, to promote a gateway concept. And I have said that if God places you at the center of the equator and the Greenwich Meridian, and you borrow money to promote a gateway concept, there is something wrong with your psyche. Because you don't call yourself the gate when you are at the center. Now, by that very location, it is enough for us to become a power hub. And by a power hub, I mean power as in electricity. To be able to wheel electricity across, and therefore the services sector, if I were to recommend, should be increasingly looking at encouraging more location of power industries in Ghana, because there is technologies exist to wheel it across the rest of Africa. With the AFCFTA, it is possible for you to be in Senegal and buy your power from Ghana, provided the gateway rules are done and the structuring is done. And again, there is enough studies to show that this is doable. Now, number 5 is recognizing the massive legislative reforms that we need. I don't think the private sector is paying much attention to that, but there's a lot we need to do there, including some of the things with the GIPC law, reserving places for Ghanaians and things like that. Once we have ratified and we are dealing with the area, unless we are trying to be selective, which is allowed to some extent under the AFCFTA, but we need to rethink how we approach and what we define as foreigners under our investment regime. The reason we have to do that also is that you will notice that FDI is increasingly becoming a multi-country approach. people are stopping deciding that, I mean, or foreign direct investors, if you want to look at that way, I want to invest in Ghana alone. They look at a number of countries because they take an advantage of the bigger market. So the idea that GIPC alone from one country is trying to attract investments need a defined strategy, a redefining of the strategy, where a group of GIPCs, for want of a better word, can actually campaign or lobby for foreign direct investments altogether. But as I've indicated earlier, I don't think our progress is entirely dependent on FDIs as we currently define it, and I'll touch on this shortly. We need to be looking at private sector sentiments, and particularly, I think we are so focused on inflation indexing. I know that the Bank of Ghana will be addressing this academy in the course of this 3-day lecture. I will be very happy to hear what they will be saying about this inflation indexing in the course of this AFCFTA era. But we are so focused on AFCFTA that our data analysis doesn't appear to say much about both consumer sentiments and private sector sentiments. In the study I referred to in 8 countries, as much as 85% of persons we interviewed in certain countries, including our own, knew everything about the AFCFTA, and I'm talking about manufacturers and private sector people. But when we asked them the simple next question, and as to whether they were planning in their strategy over the next 5 years for the AFCFTA, the answer was no. Only 16% of them were developing strategies for the AFCFTA for the next 5 years. When you flip the same question about expansion on extra-Africa trade, the percentage went to over 40%. Now, that tells you that it is not lack of knowledge of the AFCFTA, but the ability to strategize to take advantage of it and see in Africa as a market. Also, our ability to see that the service sector itself is a potential export market. And it comes in several forms. Mauritius is a very good example. Mauritius has the largest number of accountants per square meter in the whole world. And in an era post-COVID, where people can be hired offshore, as I speak to you, there are banks around the world whose accounting are done in Mauritius. And all that they do is to ship it back for the auditors to audit it. Now, there are a lot of service professionals here who can sit here and work anywhere in the world. But we do not see them as export potential. And again, that's how I would rather want to see the AFCFTA. Intermodalism and transport chain is a massive way that if we promote it, and at times we work across purpose, we need to think differently about intermodal transport and how, and I will return to that subject before I land, so let me skip it for now. I think thinking about the private sector will not be concluded, will not be complete if we don't talk about the private sector enterprise mindset. We have an enterprise challenge. The way the private sector thinks about business itself needs to change. The sole representative mindset ought to change. There are many private sector businesses who are happy to say, I'm the sole representative of some manufacturer. It's very popular. Why do you want to be the sole representative instead of the sole value-added entity or the manufacturer? Those are some of the things we need to look at. Or the 100% owner of only one instead of the 10% owner of 100 ought to change. Because you cannot grow big if you are not collaborating or merging across the borders. And again, that's an impact that the private sector needs to look at. I've talked about our quality and upgrading as separate from upscaling and then consolidation. And the lack of strategy of the private sector. Prof talked about lack of strategy on the part of governments. I'm somebody who tweets a lot about that. African governments tend to lack strategy. But indeed, the private sector also lacks strategy. The private sector is even worse. Most private sector entities have not developed their own corporate strategy for the AFCFTA as I speak, and I advise many, so I do know what I'm talking about. Some of the things we need to watch include realigning the national psyche itself. Now, Africa relocation in terms of businesses spreading across Africa for the AFCFTA will be determined a lot by collaboration. And another factor we tend to overlook, what I call internalized business-to-business activity. Let me just explain. It's easier for a Nigerian businessman to buy from a fellow Nigerian when looking for input than it is for a Ghanaian to buy from a fellow Ghanaian when looking for input. That's a fact. I mean, the Ghanaian would rather buy from another Nigerian or an import, even when the input is sitting next door to his or her manufacturing base. So if you have your B2B, the business to business, not internalized, it undermines your ability to reduce your cost when you are adding value. And those are things we need to talk about. We need to recognize that the Pan-African payment system launched recently by Afraism will make it easier for me to buy flowers in Nairobi, pay cedis, and let the person in Nairobi receive kwacha, shilling, or to buy in Chima from Lusaka and let him receive shilling, receive kwacha. And therefore, it's important that we do not put bottlenecks that prevent people from trading across the border in that simple way. The more difficult we make it, the more difficult it is for us to buy our goods from here. Now, I said I was going to come back to this point. Our idea about private sector growth, it's important we understand that private sector growth and FDIs is actually triggered more by domestic investments than by just looking for foreign direct investors. There's enough proof, about this. And again, just for want of time, I will skip it. And therefore, we need to stop struggling with whether we want free zone or export processing zone or special economic zones. Again, Prof. Aka talked about this, and I want to emphasize it. In a country where acquisition of land is so complex, special economic zones is the thing to go for. Because with special economic zones, you have the advantage of ensuring that businesses are located in one area. I know we have challenges regarding how much tax we will lose, but there is no problem without a solution, right? And there's a reverse of that saying, which I will talk about also. But having said that, it's easier to have all of them co-locate, and it's easier to integrate the SMEs into the value chain if we encourage special economic zones. And I think the time for free zones and export processing zones, which is what we have had so far, need to move to special economic zones. Ethiopia is an excellent example of this, and they are one country who is going to take a very big advantage of the AFCFTA as compared to Ghana. It's also important for us to understand that FDIs, and I'm coming back to FDIs, even if we forget about the domestic investment, which we don't seem to measure or take much account of, and I'm saying domestic investment is a trigger for FDIs. But even if we want to talk about FDIs alone, it's important for us to understand that under the AFCFTA, FDIs will no more be driven by the traditional factors of political stability. We still talk about these things, and I get surprised when I hear them, that Ghana is politically stable, we have democracy, we are educated, we have workforce and English language. That's not what is driving FDIs anymore, not even currently. FDIs are being driven by cost of living factor in the country as against the amount of receivables a business has. What the business measures is what is the return of investment. And he simply nets what I spend in the country with what I get at the end of the day and what I'm able to export. The stability and the rest is common. Once you have any situation where the factors become common to many people, that factor has become commoditized. And selling it is no more an advantage. And we have to recognize that. The other factor, so I will keep that factor as a constant. The other variable factors will include availability of good schools, hospitals, housing, entertainment, all the other factors that, all things being equal, make you better. And let me give an example of why this is important. Today, it is possible to buy power in Ethiopia at about approximately between 6 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. For Ghana, you may be doing anything between 13 to 19 cents per kilowatt hour. But the average product you have, 30% of it is contributed to by power. So if your power is high, if your cost of borrowing is high, if your transportation is not efficient, you've already made yourself less competitive. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much democracy you have, of how many years there has been no coup in the country. There hasn't been any coup since 1981. Everybody knows that. So it's no more an advantage for us to tout. We also have to stop becoming paying too much attention on what I call sensational publications. Example, publications like the erstwhile Doing Business Index, which has now been stopped by the World Bank itself because of the the scandal relating to the fact that some countries were manipulating it. I've contributed to tons of this doing business index. Now, it focuses on the formal sector in the first place. Our sectors are largely informal. If you look at the Africa Trade Observatory, you will find out that a large amount of informal sector businesses are not exactly captured. And I always give this very simple example. Egusi is traded between Ghana and Nigeria regularly. Just go to Malata, you will see it. When it's short in Nigeria, they buy it here. When it is short in Ghana, we buy a reverse. Almost every egg you buy across the border in Togo and Benin comes from Ghana. But these are not being captured. And therefore, if you publish a doing business index which focuses on the formal sector, you are missing what we ourselves agree is 80% of our economy. Then it is also using standardized scenarios. It overlooks innovation. It doesn't capture innovation. It focuses on a business case for FDIs. So it doesn't actually reflect what we need in order to take advantage of the AFCFTA. It tends to externalize our perspective of investments and makes us lose hope. And especially when we are not measuring business sentiments, we do not know whether even businesses are bullish or not bullish. And these are things that, in my view, we need to pay attention to. Then I think the private sector itself has to solve this problem. One, it doesn't lobby government enough. It looks for favors from government instead of lobbying government. It doesn't upgrade its products to ensure that it can meet international standards all the time. And especially closely held enterprises have a bad culture of wanting to pass on everything to relatives, even when they are incompetent. So, as a result, the likelihood of taking advantage of the AFCFTA will be minimized if we don't pay attention to this. Then, as a whole, private sector should put or coordinate a lot with government to ensure that we have a concerted strategic action in responding to things which are beyond us. No matter how well you plan, there are events which will happen which is beyond you. What is important is not the event, it's how you react to it. One is COVID-19 and redirection of supply chain. Now, most of the enterprises I saw rushed to do masks, sanitizers, etc. And I have had occasion to say that I do believe with vaccines and all the rest, by 2030 we will not be wearing that many masks. Now, you see that one of the things we could have paid more attention to is what is it being produced in China, which, for example, was not coming through because of COVID. And how do we convince buyers that relocating to Ghana is cheaper? That's one of the things that I probably it's been done that I haven't heard, but I'm recommending that we pay more attention to this. The Ukraine war, a lot is talked about the Ukraine war depending on who you support or who you don't support. Prof talked about wheat. But one of the things that is not talked about much is the fact that because of the sanctions, a lot of Russian businesses are exiting. And Russian businesses are in Africa and they are in Ghana too. Who is replacing them? Another foreigner? Or we are promoting local entities to replace them through structuring funding structures that will enable them to pay the equity over time so that we can meet the rules of origin. A lot of the rules of origin will require that input is taken from here. Without that, we are not meeting the rules of origin. And that's how we ought to be thinking. Now, we ought to also respond to the issue of global tax rate. Mauritius, as I speak to you, is gradually becoming less attractive if my information is right. And I think my information is right because my own firm is registered in Mauritius anyway. Now, for many years, they enjoyed the global tax rate of 3%, even though the G20 has been pushing for the global floor ceiling of 15%. I'm not sure to what extent other countries are implementing it. But just that 15% changes Mauritius' fortune. In other words, minimum tax rate is 15% across board. Now, if that happens, assuming that happens, how do we respond when our corporate tax rate is 25%? Is there a way we are thinking about practicing discriminatory tax rates so that we can become more competitive for sectors or entities that relocate to this place? And again, that is why I said I was going to come back to this. I believe the Ghana Statistical Service and Bank of Ghana ought to be talking more about some of these things and consumer sentiments and business sentiments and how we take advantage, and a bit less about than inflation indexing. I'm not against inflation indexing, but I think we've been indexing inflation for 50 years. and I'm not so sure to what extent that has triggered a multiplier effect in growth of the economy. Having said that, I said just a few minutes ago that every problem has a solution, but every solution also creates a problem. And that AFCFTA itself will create a problem for some businesses. Integrated Africa, open access to markets, cheaper goods from other sources, free movement, all these things will have its own problems. But every problem, the solution to that problem itself may be a business opportunity. And multiple factors will determine our ability of the private sector to be able to take advantage. So in one breath, it may be a threat. For others, it may be a challenge. A single Africa passport, which is one of the collateral things that is under Agenda 2063, which I hope will happen very soon, will make movement easier, and probably to make it easier for businesses to be able to source materials and move their goods around, etc. So it depends on whether you are seeing it as a threat or not. What I will want all of us to remember, that before colonization and before the partition of Africa in 1874, this is how we looked like. It was a very open Africa, whether there were cars or planes or camels that we used, whatever it is, we moved across the borders freely. Then we created a situation where post-colonial era, we divided ourselves into these 55 countries, and our desire to trade with each other is still there. It's never been lost. To the extent that we created between 12 and 15 regional blocks, ECOWAS, SADC, etc., depending on who is counting. So clearly we want to trade with each other. And there's something I keep emphasizing. Before AFCFTA, we had hit almost 17% of intra-Africa trade. I heard Beatrice talk about moving from 10% in 1995. But that's before AFCFTA. It means African has the desire to already trade, and we are trading. And therefore, the AFCFTA only provides the private sector and governments the platform by which to have jump and have an exponential growth. And that's how we have to see it. Because at the end of the day, this is the Africa we are going to see if the AFCFTA is implemented. One flat continent, appearing borderless, but each country asserting itself. The ability of private sector to compete and develop in this new Africa depends on how our mindset is and how we work with our governments, our private sector to take advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Participants, I'm sure we've all had 3 brilliant lectures. And so let's give all 3 a good round of applause. Thank you all very much. Our time is quite spent, but I think there should be time for a few questions. Maybe 3 from each of the 3, if we are fast enough. So
Hello.
We'll open up. We'll take about 3 questions. Get them answered. Another 3. Then I think we'll be ready to go. So maybe 9 altogether. Okay. So we all have microphones. So we're open for question and answers. So you identify the speakers at the keynote, Miss Beatrice Kato or Prof. Aka or Mr. Ofusu Dote. Yes. So you mentioned the first, second, or third speaker, and then your question. Yes. Oh, sorry. The hand. Yes.
May I ask my question? Hello?
Yes. Microphone.
Is it okay? Okay, great. Okay, good evening. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My name is Emmanuel Bensa. I work with the African Continental Free Trade Area Policy Network based here in Accra. I'm here with my colleague this evening. Thank you very much for very thought-provoking insights. I think the whole idea with the African Continental Free Trade Area has been to remind us that the process of regional integration as envisaged by Kwame Nkrumah is not dead. It's an ongoing process. ECOWAS just turned 47 last week, 28th May. There was absolutely no celebration or conversation about that, unlike previous times, which was curious because for a very long time, there had been some attempt by, for example, last 2 years, ECOWAS Parliament had some celebration, reminding us about the benefits of integration. Free movement, West Africa and East Africa, for example, are the two regions on the continent that do free movement very well. We have challenges, we have insecurity in West Africa, we have all the things happening with Sahel coming into West Africa, peace, and those are problems. However, free movement has been around since 1979 in West Africa. Then you read a story about the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, then you read further and you realize that the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area is stating that in the next couple of years, the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, which would, it's a 6-lane corridor which would bring the capitals of Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire.
Sorry, please don't give another talk. You've gone on too long.
Okay. Let me come to the point.
Yes.
All right. So basically, the Abidjan-Lagos corridor is going to bring the capitals of 6 West African countries together. The idea, probably 2030, should be ready. The After Secretary General says that this Abidjan-Lagos corridor is going to be probably one of the most vibrant corridors on the continent, because you're going to have support from East Africa, for example, bringing their expertise on how they have been able to digitize their customs and so on. I want to find out from from Beatrice, please, Chaito, for example, beyond digitization of the customs process that East Africa has been able to do, what is it looking so very interesting about the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, reason for which Secretary General Wamkele Mene would say that he feels that West Africa is going to be a very vibrant region, and therefore what kind of hope would that offer West Africans who may feel that this is not a region to still stay in because we've had so many problems? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The second. Please state who you are and where you're coming from.
I'm Philemon Achodankwa from Universal Merchant Bank. So 2 questions for Beatrice and a comment for Prof. So Beatrice, reference to Article 29 of the AFTA agreement, so specific reference to technical assistance and capacity building. Just want to understand, are state parties required by law under AFTA to commit resources, or is it by moral suasion? So that's my first question. Second question is reference to Article 31, implementation and monitoring and evaluation. Again, I think we've not done well with the various blocks, AOU, ECOWAS, with respecting protocols. How different are we going to execute after? So that we don't end up 2 years, 3 years down the line, then people are breaching all over the place, but obviously because state parties are coming in liberally, you cannot enforce those protocols. So that's my 2 questions for you. Then lastly for Prof, you ended your presentation excellently with we need a Joseph. There are various governments and various countries at play here. Where we don't locate a Joseph, how do we get institutions to work so that the Josephs can replicate themselves, so that private sector can lead this chat, so that we don't wait for another Joseph to come, we can create Joseph ourselves. Thank you.
Yes, so can I have the speakers?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Emmanuel, who happens to be a colleague of mine. I actually didn't hear, or I probably didn't appreciate the, and I wasn't following the remarks of the SG. Are you suggesting that he was saying that it was the whole concept of the digitization of the Lagos-Abidjan corridor that makes it so unique? That would open up trade between the countries? I see. Oh, I see.
But apart from that, I just wanted to find out that clearly that couldn't be the only reason why he felt Abidjan-Lagos corridor is going to be one of the most vibrant corridors on the continent in the next couple of years. There must have been something else that he saw. So,
okay. Well, I actually don't know I'm not privy to the thought processes of His Excellency. But I imagine that, maybe the idea is that the Lagos-Abidjan corridor can be a similar type of corridor as you have, other corridors in East and Southern Africa. So it could well be that it's all about lesson learning, benchmarking, making sure that the models that have worked in other parts of Africa can also be put to bear for the Lagos-Abidjan corridor, and that's all I can say on that. In relation to the two questions posed about the agreement, in terms of technical assistance and capacity building, in effect, the provisions in the agreement are binding on all states. However, the extent to which technical assistance and capacity building is provided is really a sovereign matter. It's a matter of the ability of a particular country to provide technical assistance and capacity building. So I would expect that it is perhaps a little bit more than moral suasion, because of course when there are issues where there needs to be cooperation, we've seen it under COVID, for instance, then African countries do tend to step up and assist each other. So since it's in the agreement, it would be a little bit more than moral suasion, but there wouldn't necessarily, in effect, it wouldn't be sort of like an actionable provision whereby if you don't provide capacity building and technical assistance, you can be taken to the dispute settlement system. So that's what I would say on that. It's effectively much more of a collaborative approach based on precedents that has already been set down. On monitoring and evaluation, how different? Well, there are moves now to try to institutionalize monitoring and evaluation. Under the Office of the SG, there will be a specific department for strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation. And that aspect is seen as very, very important by the Secretariat. So that will definitely get attention down the line. And the idea is to also involve civil society and other actors in ensuring that there is monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the agreement. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, Madam Chair, let me just contribute to that question on the Abidjan-Lagos corridor so that we... is Mr. Bensa still around, the one who has the question? I think there are a couple of reasons why it's gained prominence. One is because African Development Bank recently announced funding for it. So I clearly understand why the Secretary General will want to. And two, because the Abidjan-Lagos corridor goes across a long stretch of coastal region, which connects what is called the growth corridors to the landlocked countries from Burkina Faso all the way to the Sahel, within the 16 countries which are landlocked. And it's a very important corridor. Having said that, I don't want us to leave here with the impression that it is being isolated as a corridor. PIDA, the Pan-African Infrastructure Development Agency, has identified 69 corridors, of which the Lagos-Abidjan corridor is one. And 10 of them are being prioritized, of which the Abidjan-Lagos corridor is a major candidate. It's the only one in West Africa, actually. Because the other corridors which have gained more prominence, actually the Cairo-Cape Town corridor, which is 6,000 kilometers, and the Djibouti-Dakar corridor. So it's not just the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. And let me end by saying that much as I have heard the announcements, there are two things we need to think about or we need to reflect on. One, this corridor has been talked about for a very, very long time. Two, the intra-country political bottlenecks has actually undermined the corridor being developed. And if you take a look at it, I will just give you an example that may surprise you. Aguna Nkwanta in Ghana to somewhere around Axim, about 15 kilometers, is part of the corridor, right? And if you see that corridor as to whether it is one political party who started it, another political party who didn't start it, it de-emphasizes its importance that it will attract a lot of cargo and a lot of business to Ghana if we removed whoever designed it and whoever started it, because each country is supposed to do its own. And it creates the logistics corridor that makes us transport to the Sahel countries. So that corridor is not achieving its goal, because if one country depoliticizes it and develop this corridor, it will trigger the rest. And that's how I want us to look at these corridors.
Thank you very much. Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much for the question. So, well, it's supposed to be a comment by a question. So you're talking about institutions, and I think we quote Obama that Africa needs not strong men, but institutions. So by the Josephs, I'm talking about actually institution. Joseph is an institution. It's time for Africa to begin to produce the kind of Josephs through our family system, our churches and mosques, our culture, our education system, that produces hardworking men, men of integrity and faithfulness, who will not entertain corruption even when they are bribed, like Joseph was. So Joseph didn't just arise. There was a kind of family training and upbringing that brought a man like that up right from childhood. He will not entertain evil. Even when he saw his brothers misbehaving, he reported them to his father. And when he had the opportunity to corrupt and to sleep with Potiphar's wife, he preferred to die. He said, I cannot sin against God and my master. Even in prison, he was hardworking and a leader. So everything he did prospered. We have come to a time where our education system is just focusing on STEM, science, technology, and we have left character and morality and upbringing, to the extent that we are producing corrupt thief, intellectual thieves all over Africa, and that is a very sad thing. So we need to back again restore integrity. And if you look at our national anthem, Lagos anthem, integrity, if you look at most of African national anthems, they talk about God. Righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to every people. Africa, even though we are very religious, it's sad that we are very corrupt and we lack integrity and faithfulness. And that is one of the sad things. Now, the institutions that should have stood, like civil society organizations, UTAG, TUC, and co., even the media, are being bought. They are being political. They are joining NDC, MPP all over. So nobody is able to stand and speak for the right and be like a Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. If I perish, I perish. That kind of situation we are dreaming, that we'll have that again, where people will be able to stand and speak the truth and demand good governance and accountability from our people. I pray that we'll get there one day.
Thank you very much. Yes, okay. So I think we'll just have one round from our students. So there's one here and then two. Right in front here. And make it very brief. Because
My name is Kojo Addison. I'm with Food and Drugs Authority, Ghana. And my question is, with the AFCTA, this question I think will go to Ms. Beatrice and Mr. Ofosu. Is there any tangential agreement that when businesses who want to partake in the or want to benefit from the AFCTA, would there be any agreement that will prevent businesses from relocating to other countries to seek for lower wages or to look for lower wages or for lower regulations and also looser environmental regulations? Because companies which want to benefit from the AFCTA also like to employ people, and by then, would their workers, those whom they will employ, is there any regulations that will prevent them from paying their lower wages or relocating to other environment with looser regulations?
Okay,
thank you.
We need two more from the students.
Thank you very much. I am Reverend Kingsley Amwa, the Executive Secretary to Civil Society Coalition for AFTA. My question goes to Madam Beatrice. With the current advocacy for the protocol on trade, that is the protocol on trade by women and youth, so far, what is the status of that negotiations? Yes, we want to know, so that women and the youth can have a greater space within the AFTA. Because research has shown that within the SME sector, women are leading across Africa. And we need that as part of the compact so that we can ensure that we mainstream women in our businesses so that the youth can also be inculcated with a sense of entrepreneurship. And the second question I want to ask is...
No, one question, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any of our students? There's one student. Okay, that's all right. Let's one? Okay. One more. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so my question goes to Madam Chaito. I don't know whether I heard you correct, but you made mention of a protocol for youth and women. Is that, under what phase will that protocol come? Is it under phase 2 or maybe a possible phase 3? And my last question is to get to know whether the AFCFTA Secretariat has any specific guidelines for how states can classify goods under the sensitive goods or the excluded goods, or that is left to the discretion of the member states. Thank you.
Thank you. I think speakers.
Thank you so much for those questions. In terms of the labor and environmental considerations, effectively you're asking whether there will be a kind of race to the bottom to try to lower environmental standards or to lower labor and working conditions. Both the agreement generally, and then I think this is also coming in the context of the investment protocol. There will be some kind of provisions for a kind of safeguard against that. So there will be some, at least some minimum standards. There will be a kind of, not a prohibition necessarily, but there will be an admonition for countries not to kind of like lower their environmental standards in order to attract investment. Same with labor standards. In terms of the protocol on youth and women, that came under phase 3, but in fact phase 2 and 3 are being done simultaneously. So digital trade, protocol on youth and women, if you recall, it was at the extraordinary summit in December 2019 that there was December 2020, that there was an the urging by the president of South Africa for there to be a protocol on youth and women. And so all the background work to define the issues, contextualize the protocol is all taking place, and there will be the usual process of identifying the issues, putting that in a zero draft, and moving forward in terms of trying to negotiate. But at the same time, also, I believe that there will also be some dialogues and some conferences to kind of bring on board as many of the stakeholders that are really interested in this issue as possible. So that is the current status. The question about clarifying the goods under sensitive and the excluded. As you know, 7%, so 90% is automatically, progressively goes to 0. There is a 7% sensitive, and it is up to countries to choose which of those products are sensitive. However, the idea is that the excluded, there's some kind of formula. So now, I'm not a trade in goods expert, just bear with me on that. But effectively, the idea is to ensure that not the goods that are put in the sensitive and excluded list don't effectively undermine the idea of liberalization and opening up of markets, and they don't kind of outweigh the 90% tariff lines. The idea is to make sure that the protocol is commercially meaningful and that what is being liberalized has real commercial value. So that's the simplest way I would put it. So there's a formula that was developed with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and that is what has been applied. And so, but again, it goes back for a process of negotiation. Which products are sensitive? Are they really? Do they meet the criteria for the national importance or some critical commodity criteria? And then on the excluded, again, making sure that the formula is done so that, again, doesn't undermine, and that the value of what is in the 3% excluded doesn't outweigh the 90%. And I don't know if David wants to add anything to that. He can help out with that. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So we've exhausted our questions. Well, another round of applause. We think this is an extraordinary discussion. Thank you so much. Then I don't think I can even attempt to summarize, but a few take-home message. I think it's quite clear that AFCFTA is the flagship that Africa can use to make this gigantic first step for prosperity in the future that you see for us. But there are specific opportunities, that is eliminating the tariff lines. I think also a couple of important things is removing restrictions, easing the cross-border interactions, developing infrastructure, stable markets, and then we come into for ACA industrialization, promoting the structural transformation that we need, how the incongruities can be resolved, and bad governance, to make, in order to get accelerated growth. And then I don't think we've really taken into account the importance of private sector in all this development. So that's my simple take-home message, and I think it's been an extraordinary section, and we thank you, all of you, for a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, for the closing remarks. And with that, we have come to the end of this evening's session, which is day one of our 3-day public forum on the African Continental Free Trade Area, Challenges and Prospects. Tomorrow will be the second day of the public forum, and the sub-theme for tomorrow is Political Economy of African Trade. There will be lectures by selected scholars and experts, and we will have another question and answer session. Please join us tomorrow at this auditorium at 5:30 p.m. Now, to acknowledge the schools here with us this evening, we have Accra Academy, we have Presec Legon, Accra College of Education. Have I left any out? Did I hear yes? Who is left out? Okay, I think I got all of you. Well, so I'd like to thank you for your presence here and participation in this event. You've been a wonderful audience. There will be bagged refreshments for you. So as you leave, remember to pick up one bag of refreshments so that you can quench your thirst and assuage your hunger after sitting for a few hours. Thank you very much. May I now ask you to please stand as the speakers and the chair leave the podium.
I first met UMB when I was at the crossroads of my business. I had a serious problem, and UMB has made it possible for me to still stand today.
Convertible and growing. We know that's how you need your money. For the dynamic small or medium scale enterprise of today, cash flow is crucial to survival. Hence, with our thorough understanding of both local and international markets, we address your liquidity concerns in two main ways. Our deposit services comprising the UMB current account, call account, sweep account, fixed deposit account, and treasury bill services. And our foreign currency services comprising purchase and sale of foreign currency, spots and forwards, and inbound money transfer. With UMB Business Banking Treasury Services, you can count on achieving your financial objectives with your money at highly competitive growth rates. UMB. Industry is the engine of a nation. Local corporates like companies in the agri-processing, commerce, manufacturing, oil and gas, telecom and construction sectors convert energy from the country's resources into useful products. Finance fuels all enterprise. Non-banking financial institutions composed of insurance, pension management, credit unions, microfinance, savings and loans and finance houses help enable businesses and individuals to sustain their activities. Not-for-profit organizations including NGOs, embassies, medical facilities, educational institutions, faith-based organizations, bilateral or multilateral agencies provide the structure to assist those in need of support. Multinational corporations and enterprises are the doors that open to connect us to the rest of the world. And government, which incorporates government business and parastatals such as the ministries, government agencies, departments and related businesses, serves as the wheel to steer the population. If any of the notable entities mentioned characterizes your organization, then UMB Corporate Banking is just for you. Join us and let's drive our world together. UMB. In the circle of life, beginnings are very important to us. So are foresight and preparation. That's why we give you an early start with the UMB, ABC, and piggy bank accounts. A spirit of innovation and our conviction to impart financial responsibility to those growing up drives us to offer the Smart Teen account and Young Adult account. We also support your sense of aspiration. For the conscientious student, our Aspire account is just perfect. Our core values of ease and convenience are exhibited in products such as the UMB current account, UMB saver, and foreign currency accounts, making commerce and other everyday needs a breeze. We stick with you throughout the years and ensure via our Silver Saver account you can freely invest for future generations. With UMB Personal Banking Deposit products, we honor our commitment to provide you with quality solutions that will stand the test of time. UMB.
I first met UMB when I was at the crossroads of my business. I had a serious problem, and UMB has made it possible for me to still stand today. How did they do this? They did not work and put me in a box. They looked at me as an individual and got a product for me which helped me to survive the period. And I'm happy that they are still here, and I understand why they are here. Banks should look at it and see how they can also go that way to be able to meet individual customers, tailor products to suit the individual customers and not to just box everybody together. UMB, I'm happy for you, and I pray the Lord who has brought you this far, will even bring you to higher levels.
You have worked hard, you strived and achieved, and now you're acclaimed for all that is good and great. Now you can and must have advantages because you deserve it. You deserve a private bank that is there for you and works for you, so that you can have the time to enjoy and take care of what is important. It is time for the best you with UMB Prominence Banking. Private banking that delivers and works for the best you, because you deserve it.